Big news hit. Yet another coach fired late in the season, but not at the end of the season. We're so used to firings happening after. But Carolina moves on from Coach Frank Reich in a move that in some ways feels surprising because of the timing, but also what's happening has been an abject disaster. So I guess I should clarify here, not just Frank Reich fired, also Josh McCown and Deuce Staley. So they let go a bunch of offensive minds at once. So C-Rob, let's start here. Why now, in your opinion, from this?
There's a lot of ways to approach this. I'll go back to when Tepper fired Ron Rivera, one of the things that he said is, I don't want to give away a competitive advantage of waiting to do something I know I'm going to do. And so I think he knows, I'm going to fire Frank. Let's just do it now. I don't want to wait. I want to get moving on the next coaching search. I don't want to do it behind his back. So let's just get this whole thing started. But in terms of the why, and that leads into the why now, they'd gotten to a point, I talked to a number of people involved sort of in the middle of this, not sort of, definitely in the middle of this. And what I was told was they had come into this season with this idea that, okay, it is a Frank Reich offense, but I think they thought it was going to have a little more Thomas Brown injected into it. Okay, so sort of a Frank Reich offense that was a little more updated. Maybe you're going to run some RPOs. You're going to do some things that have seen sort of offensive evolution over the last 10 years. Instead, what it ended up being was an offense that I think internally some people thought was kind of basic, a little vanilla, was not high on creativity factor. And then you had at one point Thomas Brown calling the offense when it's Frank's scheme. And so there was sort of this thing that developed internally about like, shouldn't Frank be calling his own scheme? Is this part of the problem? The sluggish nature of what's happening here. The offensive line has fallen apart. We have a mixed coaching staff that David Tepper, when Frank Reich was putting his staff together, David Tepper really wanted to see a lot of experience on that staff and didn't want Frank Reich to just lean on familiarity. So you ended up with a bunch of assistants coming from different places, different cultures who didn't know each other. They're all working together. And then you had a special teams coach, Chris Tabor, and then you had an offensive line coach in James Camp, and these are two holdovers from the previous staff. And from what I was told, Tepper had a good relationship with these guys. He was definitely in favor of retaining them. So you had kind of a mixed staff. And when things aren't working, I think there's frustration on the staff. I think some of it gets pointed at the head coach. I think the owner's talking to different people, trying to figure out what's going on. They try to fix some things. They try to change some things. And it just got to the point where I think the frustration for David Tepper became overwhelming. He's like, nothing is working. We've tried fixes. We've tried changing play callers. We've tried to influence the scheme changing a little bit or updating or freshening, and that hasn't happened. We got to do something here. And if there's one thing that he's shown, when he decides he's going to fire somebody, it's over. Like he makes the decision, it's done. And that's how Frank Reich ends up going out so quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, I would really encourage everyone to read C-Rob's piece that's on the Yahoo site right now, because he talks to so many people, and he really, rather than saying like, here's what did it, when life is more nuanced than that, C-Rob really breaks down the scheme element, the personality clashes, how David Tepper complicated all of this. And when I read it, I'm just thinking, in some ways, building a coaching staff is like dating. It's not just, are they good people? Are they capable people? It's, are you compatible? And I think you really need to understand, are your schemes compatible? Are your personalities compatible? Are you willing to do the work to grow together? And I feel like they were 0 for 3 on those, or maybe not unwilling, but they certainly didn't get there. And I think that when you have that, Sierra makes the good point of like, okay, well, you have the instability that comes from firing a coach midseason, but also if you know he's on his way out and there's these constant clashes every day, you have David Tepper leaving the locker room after the game, dropping F-bombs. You have this like specter of CJ Stroud's success hanging over Bryce Young's lack of development, which I did talk to people inside the building who are like, yeah, was that the only reason Frank Reich got fired? Absolutely not. But did that factor in, and does that perception matter? It does. And I think when you get to it, it's not crazy that they're starting over. But C-Rob and I were talking about this yesterday when Tuesday morning, David Tepper has this press conference. And what was very noticeable is that he didn't say like, here's what went wrong. He didn't say, here's what we need next, or here's what I'm looking for. And I get that they're not hiring a new coach yet, but he really just kept saying like, I'm going to keep all of that in-house. You can speculate, which I love that C-Rob in his column was like, all right, man, if you want me to speculate, I can speculate. And he did, and a pretty informed speculation at that. But I think you get to this point where if you want the coaching staff to all take accountability for where they're going in different directions, and the team owner is getting up there and taking very little accountability. I mean, he had everything, the buck stops with me, it's my fault, but not explaining what he did wrong and understanding. And I think to take ambiguous accountability rather than understanding what you did wrong, I don't think is very effective. So again, a lot needs to be fixed beyond a new head coach for this Carolina Panthers franchise.
There's a lot of different angles to this, and we're going to break them all down because this is such a big story. But I want to start just based on what both of you are saying here. I want to start from a different spot than a lot of people are talking about. Why the hell did Frank Reich take this job? Because you only get so many stabs at being a head coach, and you already got let go once. So you have to know that you're not going to have a lot of other opportunities. So when you start talking about the things, C-Rob, that were stacked against him in the way the staff was built and what Tepper was going to do, part of what I'm struggling to wrap my mind around is why would a coach that knows that this is probably his last chance to prove he can be a head coach in the NFL take a job where he's hamstrung from day one?
Well, not only that, I think Reich, I don't know if he did it externally, but I think internally there, he was pretty clear when he took that job, this is going to be it for me. I think this is going to be my last hurrah, as a head coach or maybe coaching in the NFL. We'll see if that changes for him, given how short a run this really was. But at the time, I think what's attractive about it is Tepper pays well, number one. You knew you were positioning yourself to draft a quarterback. You knew this was going to be a situation where you were going to link yourself, hopefully successfully, to a top tier quarterback, which technically should give you a long runway if it goes well, as we've seen with Josh Allen, or I guess maybe that's not going so well. That's not the best example right now. But if you can hook yourself to an upper tier quarterback who turns himself into a league cornerstone, you're going to stick around for a while, and you're probably going to have a lot of success. So there was that too. And I don't know that it was necessarily, it came to fruition, but I think the thought process was, okay, he learned, David Tepper as the owner learned something with the firing of Ron Rivera, and then he learned something else with the firing of Matt Rule. At some point, there's going to be some gained knowledge here that's going to allow a coach to have a longer leash. That did not happen. But I think the assumption going in was, okay,
I don't think 11 games is a long leash.
Yeah, it's not. And what's really interesting about this now is literally I'm already hearing, well, you know what, the next coach is going to have a long leash. And I'm like, okay, we're going to say that again. We're going there again. No, but really the next coach is going to have a long leash. So and by the way, the roster at the time, it seemed particularly defensively, it felt pretty stacked. If everybody's healthy, it looked like the offensive line was turned in the right direction. The skill positions needed some work done, but it did not necessarily at the time look like a bad job. Now, I think in hindsight and moving forward, what they're going to have to deal with the next coach is everyone's going to talk about Tepper now. It's not just, and they'll talk about how the quarterback's sort of an outlier in terms of what you want in like the physical stature of a quarterback, and the offensive line seems to be a mess, and the skill positions are bereft of talent. But the centerpiece that everyone's going to ask now, whenever someone comes up for this job, everyone around that candidate is going to go, why would you go there? Why do why do you want to walk into that when you've seen now 3 other coaches get fired mid-season, and now you're going to add yourself to that list? Tepper's going to have some proving to do, I think, to the next candidate, whether he wants to believe that or not. He's going to have some selling to do that he is not the central problem here, despite everyone suggesting now that he is.
I think it's also interesting because you have this idea of, okay, there are only 32 of these jobs. Some of them barely ever come open. Who's willing to take it? But then on the other hand, if it doesn't go well, you are drastically hurting your chances to get the next job and to get a job that's actually stable. So I can't tell. And I've been reaching out to some coaching agents, and that's something I want to continue to look into over the next month. How much will that impact people's willingness to take the job? How much will their current situation impact it? What jobs do they think will potentially come open next year? And then also, I know C-Rob and is of the belief, and I believe it too, that they're going to want an offensive coach. But do you want a Bill Belichick type who's just such a name that he can stand up to Tepper and not care what Tepper thinks? Or do you get to the point where like it doesn't really matter because even Frank Reich had skins on the wall, he'd been around, and Tepper still had no interest in that?
I hear you on there's only 32 jobs. I think for me, from the outside looking in, that's a great reason that somebody takes their first job. Hey, like I got to get a crack at it. This organization wants to hire me. I just think that when you get to that spot where it's your second or sometimes your third job, you have to be so much more selective, because once you've failed twice, once you've failed 3 times, like the narrative shifts. Now, maybe to your point, C-Rob, Frank Reich already knew that, hey, this is going to be my last stab at it anyway. So I don't care if I fail, I'll walk out with my money and I'll be okay. It seems staggering. Now, you mentioned Bryce Young, and let's go here for a second. Like, because Jori, I think this brings back a question. Every question we had about Bryce Young when he was drafted, fair or not, about his size and about, some of the things, some of the shortcomings that may have been there, no pun intended, at Alabama. Those are going to be asked again now, because it's a new regime that's going to come in that is not tied to this first overall pick. So, like, what does this mean for Bryce Young?
Yeah, I wrote about this on our Yahoo Sports website, and I think there's a couple things. First of all, in the immediate future, he will have Thomas Brown, the offensive coordinator, calling plays. Chris Tabor, the interim coach, said that that's not a big change for him because Brown called plays during part of the season. I think that it is still a big change when you lose your head coach, your play caller, and your position coach, because Josh McCown's out. Parks Frazier, who became the offensive coordinator in Indianapolis at the end of last year after their coaching staff got gutted, he's going to be the quarterback's coach. They'll have Jim Caldwell in the room kind of helping out. And so I think in the immediate future, it's sort of what can he do this season? Where is he able to develop, whether or not that translates into wins? But I crunched some numbers because I was curious. Okay, you've got a quarterback who came into the league with a coach who, I know Frank Reich wasn't a first-year head coach in terms of the league, but he was in Carolina, his first year in this job. And so you're adjusting as the coach is adjusting. And now, less than 1 year in, he also is going to have to adjust to someone. And then assuming the interim coach doesn't get the job, which we saw last year, Steve Wilkes did a great job as interim coach and Tepper didn't keep him on. So I wouldn't expect that Tabor becomes the head coach in 2024 either. Bryce Young will need to adjust again. So of the 32 first-round quarterbacks selected in the last decade, I found that 14 of them had a head coach who did not survive until year 2. 5, including Bryce, lost their head coach before their rookie year ended, but only 2 others had first-year coaches who didn't make it to year 2, and only one other time, which is Trevor Lawrence and good old Urban Meyer, had that first-year coach not even make it through the first year. And so I think when I look at it, the 2 quarterbacks, so I kind of put this spectrum on, is Josh Rosen. The Cardinals took him with the 10th overall pick. Steve Wilkes only had 1 year in Arizona. The next year, Cliff Kingsbury comes in. The Cardinals have the top pick again. They want Kyler Murray. Josh Rosen never recovers. On the opposite end, Trevor Lawrence, you get Urban out of there. The next year, Doug Peterson comes from Philadelphia, where he had a lot of experience. And all of a sudden, Trevor Lawrence is like massively jumping in passer rating, getting rid of the interceptions, like totally changing his game. And it was like he had this all along and he was saved. And so I think if you're the Panthers, you really want to look at what went well in Jacksonville. They're not the same players, and so it's not going to be the same type of play style, but what allowed them to right the ship? What kind of coach came in? And okay, is it something like Doug Peterson? This is an offensive guy. This is a guy who had been there before. This is a guy who understood how to have the stability in the franchise and had the confidence of he'd already had the clashing with Howie Roseman in Philadelphia. He was okay with what went on there and knew who he was, what he stood for. In fact, I think kind of wanted to leave Philadelphia in a lot of ways. And so I think it's interesting. Do you have an equivalent of that who can help get Bryce Young on the right track? And the last thing I'll say on that is that what he does have going for him is, unlike Josh Rosen, the Cardinals had the first overall pick the next year to take Kyler. The Panthers don't even have their first round pick. So he's not going to have someone who should immediately be able to replace him. And I'm not suggesting that that's the right reason, but I'm thinking when you look at the history of what's happened here, it's not out of the question based off NFL history.
The thing too, though, when you look at those 2 quarterbacks, I think what helped Lawrence, there's such a multitude of things that helped to right that ship. Number one, as you said, Peterson comes in, having won a Super Bowl, having fought with ownership in Philadelphia about making the decisions about his staff. It's my staff. I'm going to make the decisions. If we can't just agree on that, let's just part company. So they did. so he stood his ground. He knew how to run the team and separate himself from ownership and say, hey, this is mine. I'm running it. And then when, he gets to Jacksonville, think of all the things that were done to help. I don't want to say reclaim Trevor, because it wasn't like he was a complete disaster, but definitely get him on the upward trajectory as quickly as possible. Not only do you add Christian Kirk, not only do you add Calvin Ridley, obviously, into this season, Travis Etienne was a player that you drafted that was out, Trevor's entire rookie season. There were just a number of things injected there that were put in place to help get Trevor moving in the right directions. Whereas Josh Rosen went through this season with Arizona, where there was really no talent around him in the roster. I don't know that Rosen and Lawrence have the same mentality as players. I think Rosen was certainly picked apart in the process for, at times how he carried himself, and then when you see Rosen go through a multitude of different franchises that wanted to give him an opportunity to, reclaim what people thought was this well of talent, he never hung on anywhere. And so that probably is suggestive that maybe it was just a bad pick. Maybe Rosen was one of these quarterbacks that comes into the league and really doesn't have it, right? And we see a number of these players. If they believe, as long as they believe Bryce Young is more Lawrence than Rosen, which I think they do. I think they were all. I'll say this too.
People I talk to definitely do.
Yeah, and let's talk. I'll say this real quick because it's been brought up a lot. He wasn't a Tepper pick, okay? Everyone was in agreement. The three big decision makers, I was told, like, how the meetings came, unfolded, and then when everybody talked about it, Tepper, Reich, Scott Fitter, the general manager there, everyone was on board with this being the guy they were selecting at number one. It was not hey, David Tepper came in and said, that's the quarterback that, I want us to take at one. So, the immense amount of belief that they have in Bryce Young, I don't think that's going to change. It's just how quickly can they do what Jacksonville was able to do for Lawrence, which is they're going to have to spend money in free agency. That's the plan to help kind of bridge this period where they don't have that top end draft capital to go and select skill position players. So I'd expect in free agency, you'll see them go and get pieces for Bryce Young on offense. I think there will be an idea of potentially entertaining. Do we have assets on defense that we could potentially liquidate to try and add more on the offensive end? Everything, though, is going to be geared toward getting Bryce Young on the right track. And I think even the way that the coaching staff was left in place, Chris Tabor takes over the special teams coach as the interim. That was and it leaves Jim Caldwell, who very easily could have been named interim coach, given his head coaching experience in the past. It leaves Jim Caldwell, it leaves Thomas Brown there to try and do everything they can the remainder of this season to get him on track. And by the way, I think you'll see them insert some things into that scheme that maybe weren't there before.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, the conversation about Josh Rosen when he came out was different than the conversation about Bryce Young. Much as CJ Stroud is playing lights out, there were real debates from great football minds everywhere about who should be the first quarterback selected. So I think I don't want the world to spin this into revisionist history where we're turning around and saying, well, there were questions about Bryce. Bryce had questions about his size. That was really what it came down to. I do think it's interesting when you talk about all of this with Bryce Young, because trying to figure out how the team moves forward. But when you guys mentioned Jacksonville, I used the Jags sort of as a reason why I think this move entirely makes sense. Like, the thing you have to do in modern NFL, I believe, is just admit your mistakes quickly. I know that Tepper is part of the mistake that was made, but I credit an organization that's willing to look around and say, yep, got the wrong guy. Like, the sooner you figure out you got the wrong guy and you get rid of the guy, write the check, move on. I don't have a hard time with that. And I think a lot of people are murdering the Panthers in this situation because it's yet another change. But if you got the wrong guy, then get rid of the guy and get the right guy, because the longer he's there, the more chance he ruins that number one overall pick, right?
Yeah. And here's the thing, too. Let's play this down the middle. Let's be fair about this, right? It's hard to look back on decisions that Tepper has made and go, yeah, that was you screwed up. Like, firing Matt Rule was the right thing to do at the time, right? I think he knew what he had and he knew what the problems were, and it was time to move on. I think firing Ron Rivera at that time was probably the right thing for the organization, because you knew where he wanted to move toward offensive coaches. That's what he wanted. He had a strong belief that we want to get a quarterback in here. We want to match that quarterback with an offensive-minded head coach, and then we can go ahead and have an assembly line of great defensive coordinators who we send off to other jobs, but we're never going to have that quarterback lose his offensive mind. And now Steve Wilks, people bring up Steve Wilks and they go, well, that's the mistake. And I get that. It's a fair argument.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, it's a fair argument. We're seeing,
especially if you get like a really good OC in there who can also focus on Bryce and not the team.
And remember, he was a minority owner in the Pittsburgh Steelers who had, Ben Roethlisberger straddled Bill Cowher and Mike Tomlin, right? And now, so it shows that you can have a top level quarterback who can survive with good head coaches who are defensive minds. But the Steelers also rotated through some offensive coordinators. Some were good, some were bad. It was a bit of a roller coaster at times. People are going to point at the Houston Texans and they're going to say, well, geez, look at how that's working for CJ Stroud. Well, guess what? CJ Stroud's offensive coordinator, Bobby Sloak's going to be on head coaching lists, and he's potentially going to lose this guy. So you're going to ask yourself, will there be a Brian Daboll effect for CJ Stroud if he loses his OC this year or next year or whenever? So I think there's even an argument to be made about why he separated from Steve Wilks, knowing he wanted an offensive mind. So I will say on the back end, most of his firings, if not all of them, have had some sensibility to them or were the correct decisions. The problem is he gets it wrong on the front end. He's not hiring the right person on the front end that he doesn't then have to fire on the back end. And the model for them going forward, I think, is really going to be San Francisco. They're looking at San Francisco. And I also think there's some very strong overlap here when you go back in time and you consider when San Francisco had that run of Harbaugh, Jim Tomsula, Chip Kelly into Kyle Shanahan, and then, two GMs, Trent Baalke to John Lynch. That was all in this compact, 3-year span where you had all these people hired, fired. And they came out of it. But the way that they came out of it, Jed York, the CEO, had to do something he had not done up until that point. Stop inserting himself into the middle of the drama between the GM and the coaching staff. Delegate it. Hire one person who you truly believe in, a strong football mind, an offensive mind. Give them the team and go, it's yours. Then add a GM who, by the way, was not a popular pick at that time. People were like, John Lynch he's a TV analyst. What the hell? He doesn't have a personnel background. And yet Jed York said, I think this is the right guy. He's going to go out and help Kyle Shanahan get the players that he wants. And then Jed York stepped back and he said, okay, guys, do your thing. And thus far, what have we seen? We've seen results. But Jed York had to step out of all the, mishigas that was going on inside the building. He was too often in the middle of that. And he has not been ever since he handed over the keys to Kyle Shanahan.
Sierra, I've got a question for you because we're talking about sort of what would be the right decision. You need this offensive guy. You need someone who would work. I'm curious, there are reports, The Athletic in particular, Joe Person and Richard Deitch, who are both very reputable reporters, saying that Greg Olsen would be interested if approached. You've got Tom Brady, who would come in and kind of potentially replace him in that Fox lineup as soon as Brady's ready to, so he wouldn't be the number one guy anymore. Greg Olsen obviously has really deep roots in Carolina. I think we can all tell from listening to him on the broadcast. So while broadcasting and football and coaching are different things, he's my favorite color analyst to listen to. He clearly knows what's going on. Do you think, one, Tepper will be interested, and two, he would be a good fit? Why or why not? And Fitz, I'd love to hear your opinion on this too.
I think a lot of Olsen. I do. I think he's I think he would be a very natural leader. Obviously, Dan Morgan's there in personnel. There's some linkage there between two people who would know and trust each other. I just don't know what he would look like as a play caller. I don't know. I from a leadership standpoint,
would he be the play caller, or would he do like a Sirianni type situation?
That's a good question. I don't know. I read that report as well, and I think my question was, it's sort of like a John Lynch, where I'm like, I don't know. Can this guy do it? I don't know what the basis of proof is, other than to see him actually go out there and start to accomplish this. That was a big question about Lynch, and Lynch began to accomplish things with Shanahan. They worked well together, and you were like, okay, wow, it ended up being the right move. I just don't know enough about Greg Olsen, aside from knowing that every locker room he's ever been in, He's been a tremendous leader. He's like, people look to him. They lean on him. The coaches have always felt
he just gets it.
He does. And the coaches have always felt like he is a player on the field that they trusted immensely, who was like another coach on the field. And you don't see that at tight end a lot, to be honest. I mean, like maybe Jason Witten, there's been a few guys throughout history, but that would be the only thing I could lean on, is just to say, I know every locker room he's been in. He's been a leader. He's a smart, good player. And that, like I said, coaches felt like he was another mind on the field that extended their staff.
I think there's a new trend happening across coaching in all sports where former players get current players, and that makes sense. But as you guys well know, to me, the most important part of the interview process is essentially the book you're walking in with of here's who I'm going to hire and here's why I'm going to hire them. And that's why, as a fan of a team that's had to hire coaches every few years, it feels like we all know that. One thing that I always think is interesting is when you start to see the reports of, hey, this person was being tabbed for offensive coordinator, but they're not going to land him. They've got this, now this person's being tabbed. Because to me, what that means is like you're going down your checklist, and the deeper you get down your checklist, the more problems you might have. So as weird as this sounds, I think, the concept of Greg Olsen coming in and being the head coach of the Panthers makes great sense to me if his Rolodex is right. Like, because you got to be able to walk in there and say, here's who's going to be my offense coordinator, here's going to be my defense coordinator, and you better be damn sure you can get them. Like, that they can come in, because you're going to need that experience with you. Absolutely.
That is such a good point, because I do think there are times where, owners, especially new owners, overlook. You want to hire someone who has a book, who can not only has a book, has a scheme, but has a book on how he will build out his staff, who is going to fill all these positions. Now, some owners in the past have liked to hire coaches where they knew they could influence the staff that ended up being hired. Nick Sirianni, as great as the Philadelphia Eagles are, Doug Peterson went out the door because of the fact that, at least partially because of the fact that he was like, this is my staff. No more influencing my staff. Nick Sirianni came in and ownership knew, hey, we can help this guy build his staff. And that's how they always term it. A general manager and an owner says, we'll help you build your staff. Now, they've done a tremendous job building Nick Sirianni's staff. And so it worked out really well there. So I think you go back and your question for Tepper, whether it's Greg Olsen or anyone else, does Tepper want to help build the staff? Because he just went through this experience with Frank Reich where clearly he had some influence over the staff that was hired or retained, and it did not work out. So what did he learn from this experience? Did he learn, hey, maybe I do need just to step back, and even though it's against my inclination as a businessman, as a entrepreneur, as a hedge fund manager, to hire one person and then go, yeah, go ahead. You fill it out yourself. Particularly billionaires that are self-made aren't going to want to say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hire somebody to get between me and 20 other hires. No, you want to be involved in all of that. So
but isn't that like what we see? Look, I love food TV, right? Like any food show. If you ever watch like Hell's Kitchen or Kitchen Nightmares or Bar Rescue, how often do you see where like, all right, I hired this guy to run the restaurant, but now I'm dipping in and suddenly I'm deciding who the chef's going to be because it's my money and the restaurant's going downhill. Like, there's a basic business principle in my mind of if you're hiring Greg Olsen, then you're hiring Greg Olsen. And this is a little like the Browns conversation we had a few weeks ago, that organizational structure matters to me. Like, at my very core, I want the billionaires. What do you do when your favorite team's owner is just bad at hiring? I want my billionaires to hire the millionaires and then get the hell out of the way.
It's Dustin Hoffman and Jon Favreau and Chef, right? Where he's the owner of the restaurant, and he's the one who's talking about how he wants to set the menu. And Jon Favreau's the chef going, you hired me to this is my realm. Why are you getting involved in my realm? You don't want the owner and the chef / head football coach arguing over what the menu is going to look like or who's going to be on the kitchen staff.
The other thing that interests me, and I know that Greg Olsen is by no means the first broadcaster who would make the transition if they end up doing this, but I do really believe that the value of him going to all those production meetings the last couple of years, meeting with all the head coaches, getting the understanding from the players of what they're going on, both allows him to really understand the opponents he'll be facing and to understand the schemes that are working and are not working in the league right now. And so this isn't just a former player coming back after however many years. This is a guy who is deeply aware of and plugged into everything that's going on. And I also think with the Rolodex, again, the production meetings can differ based off what a staff wants. But if he wanted to talk to, he's had production meetings with Ben Johnson plenty of times. Ben's probably going to get a head coaching job, not an OC. If he's talking to Bobby Slowick, if he's talking to Gerard Johnson, he likes what he's done with Houston and CJ Stroud, the quarterback's coach over there, and he wants to bring him in as an OC. They have these. I mean, I'm thinking, Kellen Moore in the Chargers, and again, obviously, clearly not the best year for the Chargers, but he and Brandon Staley had a conversation on the opposite sidelines where the Cowboys and Chargers played the year before, exchanged numbers, and that's what's going on. Greg Olsen has that opportunity every single week with two teams.
That's a really good point. I always forget about those production meetings, but you're right. I mean, Greg Olsen's, in a way, he's been doing interviews for that potential coaching book for a long time. And those production meetings are very, very lucrative from that standpoint. So that's a really great point.
So let me oversimplify here for a second, because I want to go back to some of the examples we've used, and Houston specifically sticks out in my mind. Like, we sit here and say, get it right, get the hiring right, fine. And I think hiring a coach, I'm starting to become convinced, is more about being lucky than good. Like, Miami hired plenty of bad coaches before they finally hit the lottery with Mike McDaniel, right? Like you mentioned San Francisco earlier, where they went through that period of who the hell's the coach? And then all of a sudden they nailed it. Like a year ago right now, we were sitting here saying no minority candidate is ever going to take the Houston job because all they do is hire and fire too quickly and never get the chance. And it seems bad. Like, all of it felt gross and icky. And all of a sudden, D'Amico Ryans is out here as a coach of the year candidate, rightfully so. Like, is there some element of all of this? Like, okay, fire him, spend the money, and then just hope you get lucky next time?
Remember with D'Amico, there was an institutional foothold for them. He was a former Texan, right? Like, he knew the city, he knew ownership, like he knew, so there was some familiarity there that kind of helped ownership land this guy. Whereas I think if there wasn't familiarity, maybe they don't get D'Amico Ryans, right? And so I think some of that, helped the Texans. I don't want to say luck out or luck into the right hire, but in some ways, yeah, they kind of did. Like, a lot of things clicked into place when D'Amico walked into that building. But again, going back to San Francisco, did San Francisco just all of a sudden get smart? I mean, after being just, the Jim Harbaugh, Trent Baalke war at the end of that era was really bad, and it was really messed up. And Jed York was way too deeply involved in the middle of that and not resolving it. And then what did he do after that? He goes and he hires Jim Tomsula, who's just absolute disaster. And then he follows Jim Tomsula up with Chip Kelly, who goes 2-14, who's even bigger disaster. And then he figures out, man, Trent Baalke seems to have problems with all these people, and I'm always in the middle of all this. It took him this succession of. So then he goes and gets Kyle Shanahan. But I'll say this, even that. Remember, Kyle Shanahan was very coveted, very bright mind. Everybody knew he had the goods. He has obviously the football lineage with his last name, a ton of experience, had touched a lot of good quarterbacks over the course of his career. But he also came off of a Super Bowl where, let's be real, he melted down a little bit as a play caller, right? One of the most infamous fourth quarters in Super Bowl history. And that's now going to be your head coach. It was a little risky at that time, considering what Shanahan was coming out of in the Super Bowl. And then he pairs him with John Lynch, who, again, television analyst, who did not have a personnel background. Like, you asked me, is it luck? Yeah, there had to be a little bit of luck, right? Like, that was a roll of the dice. There's no question there was a roll of the dice, particularly on Lynch, and then pairing him with a guy like Shanahan. And so, yeah, I would say there's no, perfect formula for it. You all want to be the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? Where you just have coaches for decades and the transition's great and it all kind of fits in terms of the fabric of who you are and who ownership is and the culture you want to have on the field. But those are such significant outliers right now. And I think every single team out there goes through a run of really bad coaches until they finally, get into the right one. It's just how long. And again, you can either feel good about Tepper or feel bad about Tepper. When you make those mistakes, how long do you drag the mistake around? That's the question. And, eventually Tepper's going to hire the right person. He just has to fire enough people.
But also going back to the question of, does it matter if you're just trying to get as many darts at the dartboard? I think that it doesn't matter a ton for David Tepper's pocketbook because he has plenty of money. I do think it matters for the psyche of the organization and the players, particularly if you have Bryce Young going into year 3 and he's had 2 head coaches, 1 to 2 interim coaches. I think that matters. And so I think that you have you do have what's the diminishing law of returns. Or like you only have so many times you can get this wrong with the same group of players for it to not work. And oh, by the way, you sent Christian McCaffrey out the door and you let DJ Moore go and you didn't really replace them with great players and you didn't get the coaching staff or the players who have yet done anything. Guys start to realize that.
Oh, you're definitely right about the locker room. There's no question. You screwed up enough that you're going to lose. But remember, in San Francisco, what did Lynch and Shanahan do? They went in and turned 90% of the roster over in 2 years. Like at that point, like there's nobody around left really to attest to what a massive debacle it was the previous couple of years. There's only a few people in the locker room who even were around for it. So I would assume that whoever's coming in, it feels like a hard reboot situation considering the record. Whoever's coming in is going to turn over the vast majority of that Panthers roster other than Bryce Young, right? You're going to pick a spare few guys who you feel like can make it, and then you're going to end up turning over a lot of the roster. And the question then becomes, is Scott Fitterer part of that? Is he remain at general manager? And I think most people are saying dead man walking, like there's no way Scott Fitterer can make it. I will remind people, there was a time when Jeff Fisher got fired. A lot of people looked at Les Snead and thought, dead man walking, that guy's not going to make it. And whoever is the next coach is going to want his own GM, and that's going to get so. And guess what? Les Snead made it, and he and Sean McVay worked well enough together to win a Super Bowl. And so Scott Fitterer could still make it through this and come out on the other side.
I will say quickly before we move on, I'll never forget the year the Eagles were in the Super Bowl with Doug Peterson. I went back that year and I looked at the ESPN article at the time from the year he was hired, ranking all of the coaching hires from best to worst. And Doug Peterson was ranked worst of all of the coaching hires. And everybody that had been ranked higher than him had already been fired by the time Doug Peterson was in the Super Bowl. And so I went back at the time, with radio, and I looked at several years, and the number of times best to worst coaching hires was drastically wrong. It's just a reminder to everybody that we have I'm sorry, you're going to have to bleep this, Stone, but we have no idea which ones of these coaches are going to make it, which ones aren't. So when everybody freaks out, just stop. Like, we don't know.
Jori, remember when Sirianni and Dan Campbell had their press conferences right near each other when they were hired, in terms of the time frame, and everyone was like, what the hell? Like, it was like Dan Campbell seemed crazy, like the things he was saying. And Nick Sirianni, it was just like, this guy looks like a deer in the headlights, like that entire press conference. And then look at what we're talking about now. They've been perfect for those situations. They fit with the culture of the organization. So the whole idea of like what the best and worst hires are, the fact that we instantaneously come up with those lists is just so absolutely absurd. And
that's why I love what we're doing on this show, though. We'll give you the why and the how, and just that we can answer. Like y'all can answer the why and the how we got here. And sometimes that's I always use this analogy, but like in high school when you took a math test and you had to show the work, like that's what this show's about. Like showing the work, how they got to where they were, and the final answer be damned.